Our topic this evening is art, idolatry, and iconoclasm. A lot of wide-ranging ideas here. I'm excited to explore with you. So there is a vast overlap, historically anyway, especially, between art and religion. We've had a whole lecture before, which is essentially what is religion, where we kind of deconstructed the modern Western notion of religion, which is a very cordoned off little thing that is separated out from the rest of life. And we've shown how actually this is anachronistic. It's not how religion was seen throughout time, and it is also primarily a definition that arose out of the Western understanding of religion, so especially Judeo-Christianity and to some extent the related Abrahamic religion of Islam, and why this doesn't really make it a sense outside of that context. And so in that lecture we sort of talked about how art, at its origins anyway, was a part of a wider holistic lived experience that is religion, and certainly throughout history art has been very related to religion, as some of the most famous works of art are religiously inspired. For example, the paintings here on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, in the Vatican City, in the next to the palaces of the popes. So religion has, on the one hand, provided inspiration for artists, and perhaps just as importantly, has religious institutions have served as patrons of the arts. And so, again, here with the Sistine Chapel, this famous painting of the creation of Adam, Pope Julius commissioned Michelangelo, and there's a whole play, and it was made into a movie, The Agony and the Ecstasy of, when will you make an end, Michelangelo, when will you finish this incredible masterpiece? So the patronage of this Pope Julius II, who was not a very spiritual leader, but was a military leader who was trying to revive the power, especially the temporal power of the papacy, but was also very interested in being a patron of the arts as a Renaissance prince. That was one example, a strong example of that. And one of our famous pictures that we like to use here to advertise our history, theology, philosophy lectures, the School of Athens by the Renaissance painter Raphael, is, despite it's largely pagan content, so it's centered on Plato and Aristotle and has all of these other philosophers, especially from the Greek pagan legacy, but also including actually Muslim philosophers and others. Nevertheless, this painting, ostensibly about the philosophers gathering in Athens, it's actually, the landscape that's behind is actually the new St. Peter's. And again, this is a fresco that's decorating a room in the papal palace. So it's a painting that was patronized by institutional religion. And so the famous examples of this are far too numerous to list them all off. So we've talked about some of the most famous paintings. There's also some of the most famous statues, like Michelangelo's David, representing the shepherd boy who goes on to become king of Israel, king of Judah in the Old Testament, and the Pietà, so the Mary, the mother of Jesus, with the body of Jesus after the crucifixion. Of course, the Last Supper painting, which we've done a lecture anyway on how the Da Vinci Code actually has nothing, is a crazy conspiracy theory, and actually an anti-Catholic conspiracy theory at its root. that has no basis in anything. But nevertheless, this is a very, very famous Christian-inspired, Christian-patronized painting. And of course, it's a major focus of inspiration in the Renaissance, but it was also true before the Renaissance in the West. So these are relief sculptures from over the door of Chartres Cathedral from the 12th century. And there are many more examples. So in this case, we can see here Christ enthroned and the four symbols of the evangelists, the winged ox, the winged lion, the angel, and the eagle, and beneath them the 12 apostles in relief. Of course, this is also true, this relationship is also true outside the West. And so, for example, in India, temples, like Hindu temples here, the 6th century, or in the other parts of the East, this 12th century Buddhist statue, the relationship is very widespread globally and all around history. Certainly in the West, very famously, the statues of Greek gods, but also statues devoted to telling Greek mythology. In this case, this is the death of the prophet Laocoon, who is predicting that that the Greeks are going to try to trick the Trojans, or bad for the Trojans, and they should not be bringing the Trojan horse into Troy. Whatever quid est timeo dineos adona frentes, whatever it is, I beware the Greeks bearing gifts. An episode in the Aeneid. But of course, this tradition goes all the way back into prehistoric times. Here's a famous cave painting from a cave in France from around 30,000 before the Common Era. So in this case, we have to speculate what the religious component of all of this was, but we can assume that there's an animist, a religious component that is underlying this, even though we don't have the written word to confirm what exactly they're thinking about when we're in prehistory. So the relationship between art and religion is also symbiotic, in the sense it's not just patron-client, where priests are paying artists in order to create the things that the priests want. Also, when artists actually create things, that affects religion. So, as an analogy, just like when you have an actor cast in a movie or a TV show that it gets adapted from an earlier book, that actor, like Ian McKellen for Gandalf, replaces the image in your head that you might have had before when you were reading The Lord of the Rings, before those movies were created, if you were alive like I was and reading those books before those movies are created. But now, when you go back and read The Fellowship of the Ring, like I did last week again, I can't help but think of Ian McKellen when I'm reading about Gandalf. And in the same exact way, once some artist has carved a statue of a god, like this archaic statue of Apollo from the 5th century before the Common Era, it would be difficult for all of the people in the city, in the Greek polis, where this statue was in a shrine or in a temple. It would be difficult for them probably to picture Apollo in some other way, because they have this image right in front of them to envision the god. And so it's one thing to picture a highly anthropomorphized god like Apollo. So in some sense, Apollo is a new sun god, and so he represented the sun. But he's also way more of an anthropomorphized god, so a human-like god that has a lot of stories about him really behaving like a human-like behavior, obviously with greater power and beauty and all those things, but nevertheless with a lot of the same sorts of emotions that regular humans have. But of course, the Greeks also thought of more primal forces and concepts as gods. So for example, death, thanatos. So this is a picture, a relief picture from the 4th century of death, pictured as with wings, as he's going to carry the souls of the departed back to Hades. And other concepts like strife, eris, retribution, nemesis, and fate, which is personified in ancient Greek religion as the Moirai, the 3 women who are the spinners, who are allotting and apportioning people's destinies. So, conditions, once you have made a picture, once you've made a statue, then even conditions like death can assume an image that then is visualized as you're thinking about that concept. Humans tend to anthropomorphize and personify all kinds of things. Once you take a look at, let's say you have a car and you look at it and you start seeing the headlights as eyes and you see it as a face, it's hard to unsee that once you start picturing those things. Nevertheless, even though that's been present going all the way back, there have also been critics of these visualizations. And so since antiquity, religious reformers have also been critical of the tendency of adherents in popular religion to assume that the divine actually looks like the statue or the image that somebody has carved of it or painted of the force. So, for example, the pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes famously pointed out, "But mortals suppose gods are born, wear the same clothes, and have a voice and body." But he says, "Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and black, and Thracians say that theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired." So in other words, people picture the gods as looking just like them, sounding just like them, having the same bodies as them, and wearing the same kind of clothes that they wear. And so one version or one fragment of Xenophanes' text also adds, kind of very famously and satirically, "If horses and oxen had hands and could draw pictures, their gods would look," he says, "remarkably like horses and oxen." So people make gods in their own image. So while this is a critique of a kind of religion popular in his own day, in other words, people visualizing gods in a highly anthropomorphic way, Xenophanes here is not actually questioning the existence of things like death, love, natural forces like lightning or the ocean, rivers, planets, all of these ideas and or things, cosmic forces that are understood as gods collectively. Rather, what Xenophanes is opposing is viewing these literalistically as human-like. And so instead he argues that the kind of true source in the universe is something much more cosmic, much less anthropomorphic. So Xenophanes says, one God, greatest among gods and men, exists, not at all, who is not at all like mortals in body or in thought. So he is abstracting. He's saying they're not gods that are running around that look like the statues that we have here in our temples, but rather the thing that is behind the planets moving, or the weather, or death, or love, that this is something very different from human beings, in how it's not like just like some guy. Okay, so subsequent Greek philosophical schools continued to develop these ideas. So Xenophanes is a pre-Socratic philosopher, and then after Socrates there are schools that evolve, and these include, for example, the Stoics, who have a developed idea about the divine and the interrelationship between the divine and the cosmos. So the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus, writing in the 3rd century but preserved in the works of Cicero, believed the universe itself is God and the universal outpouring of its soul. So God is the universe and the universal outpouring of the cosmic soul. It is the same world's guiding principle, operating in mind and reason together with the common nature of things and the totality that embraces all existence. Then the foreordained might and necessity of the future, then the fire and principle of ether, then those elements whose natural state is one of flux and transition, such as water, earth, and air, then the sun, the moon, the stars, then the universal existence in which all things are contained. So in other words, for the Stoics, the universe itself is a material reasoning substance, or a logos, a word, a principle. This is a word that means a lot in Greek, the logos. By contrast, Plato didn't look upon the material universe, which he saw as in flux and perishable and changeable, for the source of being, but rather he looked outside of it to an eternal, immaterial realm. And his ideas were elaborated and systematized by later Neoplatonic followers like Plotinus, writing in the 3rd century of the Common Era, of our era, who argued that the one, the source, is an utterly simple, ineffable, unknowable subsistence, something that is way beyond just some guy, not something that is human-like, as Xenophanes would say, or horse-like. So as Greek philosophers operated, though, in a society whose traditional religion named Zeus king of the gods, they sometimes continued to use that name. They continued to name their one, their ineffable source. They sometimes called it Zeus, even though in doing so, they still meant that that one source was something cosmic and transcendent and did not resemble human beings, despite the many statues of Zeus that were around that show kind of a tough older guy with a big beard. Nor does this Zeus of the philosophers do anything that resembles any of the petty human-like things that are recorded in Greek mythology, all of Zeus's philandering and so forth. So for example, in his dialogue, the Timaeus, Plato calls Zeus, or he calls the kind of cosmic father, the father of the gods, the demiurge, and cites the demiurge as the creator of the cosmos, of which all of the cosmos emanates. So when you do this, though, when you completely redefine what Zeus is, as far as the common people were concerned, this can become kind of a hard sell. So can your prior shorthand, the fact that we're talking about Zeus, can that ever really fit this new concept? So as people are still going around and they're seeing statues like this Roman copy, potentially of the lost statue of Zeus of Olympia, so one of the wonders of the world that was then later destroyed. Those copies and statues, those statues are around. Can you ever then understand Zeus as ineffable and transcendent and utterly simple, the way the philosophers are trying to reform the religion? Perhaps acknowledging that problem. In the Republic, another one of the dialogues, Plato goes so far as to suggest that in his sort of perfect society that he's making a hypothesis about, the kind of past, the religious texts of the past, Homer and Hesiod, what would effectively been for the ancient traditional Greek religion, their Bible, those texts would have to be censored in order to eliminate all of these false ideas about the gods, that gods acted like human beings, that they were filled with all these petty jealousies and things like that. Not so as far as Plato is concerned. The true eternal God and source are goodness for goodness' own sake, the Platonic ideal of goodness, its goodness self. So the idea of banning Homer and Hesiod, like I say, effectively the scripture of the ancient Greek religion, in order to change the popular conception of Zeus and the divine, is very much related to one of the themes that we're exploring today. So iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is the elimination of certain images that have traditionally existed in a religion. So this is something like happened in Greek Orthodoxy as Christians fought wars, or at least had internal civil strife during the 8th and 9th centuries over, eliminating certain kinds of traditional images and representations within religion. So let's define a couple terms. So we've been talking about iconoclasm. That's a very particular subset of aniconism. So aniconism is the absence of representations of certain figures in religions. So an example would be prohibiting material representation of God or the gods. You can't make a statue of God or your gods, or maybe draw pictures. And it could also extend beyond that. So not having pictures of holy people and prophets, and potentially even all living things can be forbidden by a religion, and that is called an aniconic religion. Iconoclasm is when a religion becomes newly aniconic and they start destroying religious imagery that had previously been part of the religion. So this is happening in a fight between people who are iconoclasts, the people who oppose representation, and people who are iconophiles, or sometimes called iconodules, people who want to maintain representations. They like this art and they don't want to destroy it. We're also talking tonight about idolatry. And so idolatry is kind of the negative term for the use of statues or cult images in religious worship. And so usually it's condemned as idolatry by opponents of the use of statues or cult images in religious practice. And also then finally we have the term paganism. Once again, this is a negative term that evolved actually in late antiquity, in the Middle Ages, to describe the traditional religions of ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt that honored multiple gods. Generally speaking, these are especially very localized religions where you have, your family gods, your local gods of all the place all around you, the civic gods as they're understood, and then these then syncretize with other towns who have conceptions of it. So your version of the chief father god Zeus in your town may have been different originally and had different stories than the one that they tell over in Ephesus, or the one as he's understood in Rome as Jupiter. But over time, as you become part of the same society, these are systematized and syncretized together. But it's all essentially this traditional religion that honors many gods in many different forms, and that we call, sometimes we say polytheism. That's also, I think, kind of a negative term that has a monotheist bias. The people in the traditional religions are not focused on the fact that there are multiple gods, as the end-all be-all of what they would call their religion, polytheism. It's only when people are monotheists that they are focused on that, and they create that word for the other. So both of them are sort of negative terms. Okay, so just as the ancient Greek religious reformers that we were talking about, the pre-Socratic and later philosophers, were continually developing more sophisticated and abstract ideas about the divine, about the reason, the source of being or meaning in the universe. And as they were rejecting earlier portrayals of the gods found in the traditional inherited religions, practices at the local temples and cults by the priests, the different myths as described by earlier ancient poets, so too ancient Israelite religion evolved originally out of a similar kind of traditional paganism, where the god Yahweh was part of a pantheon of cults, and eventually Yahweh becomes the focus of a national religion, the religion of Israel, later the religion of Judah, that forbids the worship of rival gods, and ultimately evolves into a religion that envisions Yahweh as the cosmic god. And so we've had lectures before on Baal and on Asherah. And so Asherah, the wife originally of the god El, who later El merges with Yahweh, and Asherah is for a time Yahweh's consort, and later obviously Asherah ultimately also merges with Yahweh, and so there's only one God. So in that initial context, which is effectively pagan, in Judah, in Canaan, figurines representing Asherah were ubiquitous household items. So there's not only the kind of the high art of the great cult statues in the temples and shrines, but rather there's also figurines that regular people had in their households that are probably relating to fertility rites. They've been found anyway in vast numbers at archaeological sites in Judah from the 10th century before the Common Era onwards. So originally there was a pantheon in the Western Semitic regions, so Syria, Canaan, Phoenicia. It had a relatively limited pantheon compared to all of the gods that are had, for example, by the Greeks, but it includes the supreme heavenly deity El, whose name essentially becomes the word for God, El's wife, Asherah, the mother goddess, and then a whole host of other things like Yam, who is a god that represents the sea. Lotan is a monster of chaos. It's remembered in the Bible as Leviathan. Baal Hadad, so the lord of thunder, a sky god, sort of like Zeus. Mot, god of death, this abstract concept god kind of thing. And then we have gods representing, for example, the sun. So Shapsu or Shamish, the god or goddess of the sun. Athtar, the god of the morning star, Venus. Dagon, god of crops. Anat, a virgin warrior goddess like Athena or Artemis. And then Yahweh, who is less understood and a later intrusion into the pantheon, potentially a warrior god who comes from southern tribes originally. We have in the Bible this very early poem that predates Deuteronomy but is contained within Deuteronomy, a poem called the Song of Moses, in which Elyon, God Most High, divides the sons of Adam, so all of the humanity, into inheritances for various national gods, and is said in this poem to give to Jacob, to give to Israel. Jacob is a synonym for Israel, giving the people of Jacob to Yahweh. So we read in Deuteronomy 32, when Elyon gave the nations their land, he divided the descendants of Adam. He set up borders for the tribes corresponding to the number of the sons of Israel. But Yahweh's people were his property, and Jacob was his own possession. So the pantheon seems to contract, and so we may have at a certain point, just to focus on El and Asherah, Baal and Yahweh. Baal Hadad is doing things like he's a warrior god, a sky god, who is the one who is said to fight Leviathan. Then we have other gods who are collectively called the sons of El, the sons of God, potentially in the Bible. And then we have, as a remnant, the Nephilim, the giants, who were equated with the heroes of old. Again, just a mention in Genesis. So probably in the Omride period, in the period of the ascendance of the northern kingdom of Israel, Yahweh absorbs El's roles as the northern kings promote Yahweh as Israel's national god. And then, because El had had Asherah as a consort, Asherah becomes the consort of Yahweh, and the sons of El continue to be then their court. Explicitly, by the time we get to the Bible, Baal Hadad, or Baal, is viewed as a rival of Yahweh, and so people stop worshiping Yahweh and they start worshiping Baal. And so initially, Baal is still having the presence of a rival god, but later, as the ideas evolve, there are no additional gods, and so Baal's status is reduced to that of an idol. All of Baal's roles are absorbed by Yahweh, who now, in the biblical account, is the one that is actually fighting Leviathan, the monsters of chaos. So ultimately, when we have the Bible written, Yahweh has absorbed Baal's roles, Yahweh has absorbed El, and Asherah is also, although we sometimes have it listed Yahweh and his Asherah, Asherah is ceasing to exist as a separate god, and instead, ultimately, is also all of Asherah's roles are absorbed into Yahweh. Asherah then just becomes a pole, which is another kind of idol that needs to be destroyed. And the sons of El have all been reduced in status to angels. So now there is only one God. So as Yahweh absorbed those roles of the other members of the pantheon, religious reformers at the end of the First Temple period, so by the 7th century before the Common Era, started destroying idols, so the statues or figurines of other gods that had previously been so ubiquitous and, according to the biblical account, were even present in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. So according to 2 Kings, as late as the reign of Josiah, pagan cult objects and even pagan attendants were present in the temple prior to Josiah's reforms. So we read, King Josiah took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. He also tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple of the Lord, and the quarters where the women did weaving for Asherah. So originally, temples are very different from what we now think of as most places of worship. Most places of worship in the West anyway, synagogues, mosques, churches, these are places where congregations gather in order to pray or to have other gatherings of a community. Temples, by contrast, were literally functioned as houses for the god to which the temple was dedicated, and so therefore actually always, or essentially always, included a large cult statue. And so the famous Parthenon in Athens is a place for Athena Parthenos, and that included a very large cult statue of Athena in the center. So this was not a place for worshipers to meet. Worshipers would be outside around the building. The god's presence is on the inside, where the statue is attended to by Athena's priests or priestesses. So once the reformers purged Solomon's temple of the different cult objects. Once they got rid of the Asherah pole and other symbols and statues, Solomon's temple would have resembled other Canaanite temples in the surrounding area, except for the lack of a central cult statue of the god. So that where that would have been would be absent. Instead, if we go inside, in the Holy of Holies, in the original temple, this mobile shrine, the Ark of the Covenant, would be present, inside of which was kept tablets of the law, and over which were seraphim, kind of a winged, heavenly, angelic beast. And so this is what the inside would have been like, not lacking then a big cult statue, as representations are no longer seen as appropriate for Yahweh, as the idea of Yahweh is expanded. So since the reformers now understood Yahweh as too great and cosmic to fit in a temple, he's instead envisioned as resting on the temple's mercy seat, that is the wings here of the seraphim, or the seraphim as on top of the Ark of the Covenant, while the God expands into the towering heavens. It's not, fitting inside a little temple like this. So ironically, the Bible's quintessential story about idolatry may mask a similarly lofty early cosmic conception of Yahweh. So the golden calf story from the book of Exodus. So we read that as Moses, who is leading the children of Israel who are wandering in the desert, while he is at Mount Sinai, also called Mount Horeb, for 40 days, meeting with the Lord face to face and receiving the law, and especially the tablets of the Ten Commandments, the Israelites grow impatient. And so we read in Exodus 32, when the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron, around the high priest, and he said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they'd handed him, and he made it into an idol cast into the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. And then when he's done with the idol, he brings it out and he says, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." So when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings, and afterwards they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. This is a terrible revelry that's going to happen now that they have an idol to have as in their religion. So this story, as you can kind of see, really denigrates Aaron, the high priest. There's no sense in it that Aaron tries to resist. He just quickly caves and creates an idol, and then he immediately makes an altar and begins offering sacrifices to the idol. So this is not the kind of story that is likely to have been written by one of the Zadokite priests who looked back on Aaron as a legendary, mythic, holy ancestor. And so, as we've covered, when we looked at how the Torah was written or might have been written, there are multiple different voices within it, and this passage is often assigned to an Elohist voice, if that can be identified in the Torah. Not everyone agrees that it can be, and certainly not to the priestly voice, not to the Zadokite voice, because this voice is so contrary to that. So the Elohist voice is normally associated with interests and heroes of the northern kingdom. So just to kind of review those, the different voices that are often identified in the Torah are the Deuteronomist, which is mostly just the book of Deuteronomy, then the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the priestly voice. The priestly voice, the one that is written with that Zadokite perspective, is the easiest to tease out. In that voice, Aaron is made to be Moses' brother, and almost always when Moses does anything, they talk about Moses and Aaron do this, and so they're identified together, which doesn't happen in either the Yahwist or the Elohist voices. It's not entirely certain, not all scholars agree, that J and E represent two distinct voices. They might be one stratum of voices, and that's why, for example, they're two different voices as understood in the earlier documentary hypothesis, which some scholars still think is the solution to this question of the different voices in the Torah, but maybe not so much seen that way in the supplementary hypothesis, the idea that different layers of authors are simply adding to the text. So, just as interesting in this story that we just read, as how negative it is about Aaron, is the fact that Aaron refers to this single idol, the golden calf that he's made, as your gods in the plural. So this story from Exodus actually is very highly reminiscent of actions taken by Jeroboam, the king of Israel, the king of the northern kingdom, according to the first book of Kings. So we read in chapter 12 of 1 Kings, then Jeroboam fortified Shechem, the northern capital, in the hill country of Ephraim, the main tribe of the northern kingdom, and he lived there. From there, he went down and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David, my rivals who were ruling down in Judah, in Jerusalem. If all the people of my kingdom go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will give their allegiance to their lord, my rival, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. So after seeking advice, the king, Jeroboam, made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. All the people here in the northern kingdom, we're not going to be going to Jerusalem to worship. He says, here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. So this very much echoes the same story of what Aaron said, although in this case it makes a little more sense because Jeroboam has actually made 2 gods, 2 golden calves. So he takes these 2 calves and it says one he set up in Bethel and the other he set up in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. So, like I say, there's 2 golden calves in this story. So if we look at the kingdoms as the time here or that we're talking about, where there's the larger and more powerful northern kingdom and the smaller kingdom of Judah. Judah's capital is Jerusalem at the very northern tip of the kingdom. And Jeroboam here then creates shrines on 2 ends of his kingdom, at Dan and Bethel. So Shechem and Samaria are at the center of the kingdom, kind of the capital of the kingdom of Israel, but now there are new shrines with golden calves. And so although the Bible as it's written portrays these calves as idols, it's actually theorized by some scholars that the intent here is that the calves are just like the seraphim in Solomon's temple. In other words, sometimes gods are seen to ride on little totem animals, and in this case, Yahweh would be standing 1 foot on each calf, and thus, with the 2 halves of this seat made up of two shrines, one at Dan and one at Bethel, this cosmic Yahweh could be seen as resting over and protecting the entire northern kingdom, all of Israel, as opposed to simply standing on the seraphim's wings in Jerusalem alone. So that's one possibility anyway of what these idols might have been historically as opposed to how they're described in the Bible. So the northern kingdom is destroyed in 722 by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom, Judah, maintains itself as a client of Assyria and maintains its own sort of autonomy. The northern kingdom is divided into 3 provinces, Samaria, Gilead, and Megiddo, and is ruled directly by Assyrian officials. The Assyrians carry away some of the northern elites. We've had a whole lecture on the so-called Lost 10 Tribes. Other northern members, the priests and other elite members, fled into exile, including to the court in Jerusalem, where they found new patrons in the kings of Jerusalem. Jerusalem itself now expands rapidly as it is part of the Assyrian Empire's growing commercial system. So in 1 Kings, immediately after Jeroboam, that northern king, creates those shrines with the golden calves at Dan and Bethel, we next get a rare and kind of uniquely precise biblical prophecy. So we read again in chapter 13 of 1 Kings, "By the word of the Lord, a man of God came from Judah, the southern kingdom, to Bethel, as Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make an offering. By the word of the Lord, he cried out against the altar. 'Altar, altar, this is what the Lord says. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you.'" So he's predicting the desecration of the altar at Bethel set up by Jeroboam, the king of the northern kingdom. So the name of this prophet is not even listed. It's just a prophet from Judah, but he is incredibly bold. He's not limiting his prediction to just general doom, "Thus saith the Lord, woe is to you if you do this thing." Instead, this unnamed prophet describes precisely what's going to happen to the altar in the future, and even names a future king 300 years yet to be born who will do it. So nowhere else, even in the fully literary prophecies that occur in the kind of more mythic parts of the Bible, is the Bible so precise in prediction. And yet then when we get to 2 Kings, we read that a king named Josiah does come to the throne of Judah some 300 years after the Jeroboam story is set. So Josiah, as we already talked about, and we've talked about in so many lectures, is one of these later reformer kings, along with Hezekiah, that we frequently cite. So in addition to finding a book of the law and purging pagan cult items from the Jerusalem temple, Josiah also destroys the fallen northern kingdom's shrine at Bethel, which is just across Judah's northern border within the Assyrian sphere now. It doesn't do anything. We don't hear anything about the one at Dan. That's way past way within the Assyrian Empire and way outside of the capacity of the kings of Jerusalem to do anything about. So we read in 2 Kings chapter 23, "Josiah smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the sites with human bones. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he, Josiah, demolished. He burned the high place and he ground it to powder and burned the Asherah pole also. Then Josiah looked around, and when he saw the tombs that were there on the hillside, he had the bones removed from them, and he burned them on the altar to defile the altar, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by the man of God who had foretold these things." So in other words, this is a callback to 1 Kings. Josiah then asked, "What is that tombstone I see?" And the people of the city of Bethel said, "It marks the tomb of that man of God, that unknown man of God, who came from Judah and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done to it." So this is a very much a literary prophecy fulfilled literarily. So leave it alone, Josiah says. Don't let anyone disturb his bones. So they spared his bones and those of the prophet who had come from Samaria. So just as he had done at Bethel, Josiah removed all of the shrines at the high places that the kings of Israel had built in the towns of Samaria and that had aroused the Lord's anger. Josiah slaughtered all the priests of those high places on the altars and burned human bones on them. So it's a general destruction of any rival shrines other than the cult center at Jerusalem, the Jerusalem temple. So ultimately, the convenience of this prophecy, the fact that a prophecy is so fully worked back 300 years into the past and then is seen as being fulfilled in Josiah's time by something that this great reformer king is doing, this king whose policies are in keeping with the biblical writers, or maybe some of the writers of the source texts that ultimately become the books of Kings. This is one of the reasons why early biblical composition of this section of the Bible anyway is associated potentially with Josiah's reign. So these books from Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, they follow a common narrative. They're called Deuteronomic histories, but they really only start to narrate real history, or much history that is actually historic, by the very end when we're getting to Hezekiah and Josiah. At the very beginning, it's largely mythic. They follow a common worldview that, like I say, is in line with the reformers. So it illustrates always the message or the moral of the story that Israelites are punished when they forget Yahweh and they begin to worship multiple gods. This happens every generation in the book of Judges, where the people forget Yahweh, they go and start worshiping the god of the Moabites, and other gods, and so then the Philistines come and conquer them, and then they need to God raises a judge up in order to conquer or to free the people from Philistine oppression. And so when they turn back to monolatry, when they worship only Yahweh again, then they prosper. And so the various kings in the books of Kings are judged by the biblical author based on whether they adhere to this program. And none of them is singled out with more praise than Josiah, who is called essentially a second David. He's compared directly to David. And the odd thing about it is that Josiah ultimately doesn't fulfill all of the promise that he has in the book, because his reign is cut short when Pharaoh Necho II summarily kills him in 609 before the Common Era and ends his reign. Not what you would expect would happen based on how much he is following the program set out by the Deuteronomic historians. In other words, he was definitely promoting worship of Yahweh only. So, in addition to the destruction of that then golden calf, the shrine of Yahweh at Bethel. Bethel means the house of God, the northern kingdom's southern shrine. So Josiah destroyed those. And other cult items related to other gods, destroyed idols. As we mentioned, Josiah's reforms also included rediscovery, probably really discovery, creation maybe, of a book of law, possibly the book of Deuteronomy, or an earlier version of it, which includes a formulation of the Ten Commandments. And this also now informs the other part of ancient Israelite Iconism. So we've had the destruction of idols, wanting to get rid of the worship of other gods, but now we also have the commandment against picturing or rather making statues of the God of Israel. So Moses, it says in Deuteronomy, summoned all Israel together and said, "Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb," which is the other name for Sinai. "And the Lord said, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image." Don't make an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, in Hades, or in the waters below, the waters of chaos. You shall not, so in other words, don't make images in the worship the way the way Josiah took out of the temple of the stars and so forth, the different gods and planets. "You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." So the reformers here are aniconists. In other words, they don't want to have images of God, or any gods actually, and they're also opponent of idols. So the bias against idols in the Bible expands into a full polemic against idolatry in the prophetic tradition, and this is illustrated especially well in Deutero-Isaiah. So this is the continuation of the earlier prophet Isaiah's book, written by someone probably in the Babylonian exile times, so someone from Judah who's part of the exile group in Babylon. So we read in Isaiah chapter 44, "This is what the Lord says, Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord Almighty. I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God." So we're now getting to full monotheism from don't worship any other gods the way we'd had in monolatry earlier, in earlier portions of it. Now we're to the next stage in the development. "Who then is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him," this other God that supposedly there might be, "declare and lay out before me what has happened since I established my ancient people and what is yet to come. Yes, let them foretell what will come. Do not tremble, do not be afraid. Did I not proclaim this and foretell it long ago? You are my witnesses. Is there any God besides me? No. There is no other rock, I know not one." And then he goes on to say, "All who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure are worthless. Those who would speak up for them are blind, they are ignorant to their shame. Who shapes a god and casts an idol, which can profit nothing? Who shapes a god and casts an idol which can profit nothing? People who do that will be put to shame. Such craftsmen, the people doing these things, they're only human beings. These craftsmen make tools and other inanimate objects, but he also fashions a god and then worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in the fire, and over that wood he prepares his meal, he roasts his meat, he eats his fill, he also warms himself and says, 'Ah, I am warm, see the fire.' So half of a log he's using for that. For the rest, he makes a god, his idol. He bows down and worships it. So here's this thing, something that is just a fuel source ready to be burned, and it's the same thing that is now his God. He prays to it and he says, 'Save me. Save me, idol. You are my God.' They, the idols, know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so they cannot see. Their minds are closed so they cannot understand. Nobody who is worshiping these idols stops to think. No one has the knowledge or understanding to say, half of this thing, this log I used for fuel, I even baked bread over its coals, I roasted meat and I ate. Shall I make a detestable thing from what is left? Shall I bow down to a block of wood? So this is a very harsh polemic against idols. So idols are an object that humans create, and Deutero-Isaiah here is saying it's an object just like any other, and it's clearly not a god, it's just a thing. The same polemic against idolatry continues in Judaism and Islam, and so there is a ancient Jewish midrash that tells a story of the young Abraham, when his name was still Abram, destroying all of his father's idols. And that midrash then influenced the Quran, and it takes place, and the episode is referenced in the Quran. So in the Quran, we read, "Behold, Abraham, said to his father and to his people, 'What are these that you worship? What are these idols? Will you serve false gods instead of the God, Allah?'" Allah just means the God. "Will you serve false gods instead of the God?" And so then Abraham sneaked into the temple of their gods and addressed them. He asked these idols, "Why don't you eat from these offerings before you? What's the matter with you that you don't even speak?" So they've left all of these food offerings around, and the idols aren't saying anything, they're not eating them. Then Abraham fell upon them, the idols, smiting them with his right hand. So why should anybody be giving food offerings to gods that are just made of wood and stone is essentially the idea here. So my favorite retelling of this story comes from the book of Jasher, which is a medieval Jewish expansion of the stories in Genesis and some of the rest of the Torah. This is a book that we had in translation in my house growing up, and so it's an expansion of Bible stories. In the book of Jasher, it's telling Abram, who lives to a very ripe old age, in the beginning of the story is 50 years old, essentially a teenager in patriarch terms, and he goes, he's been living in the cave and learning true worship from Noah and Noah's immediate ancestors, so our descendants, Shem and so forth. I'm not sure if Noah is still alive, but anyway, Shem is still alive, and Abraham's been learning from them. And he goes back to visit his homeland, only to find out that his father, Terah, who's an official of the wicked king Nimrod, Terah has now filled his house up with idols. And so Abram concocts a plan to expose the idols for what they are. He has his mother make a whole bunch of savory foods that he presents as an offering to the idols. But when they do nothing in response, just like we saw in the Quran, Abram takes his hatchet and he smashes all of the idols in the household except for the biggest one, and then he puts the hatchet into that last remaining idol's hand. Then Abram's father, Terah, comes home. He sees all of his idols have been destroyed and ruined, and he complains to Abram, "What have you done to my gods?" And Abram replies innocently or mendaciously, "Not so, my lord, for I brought a savory meat, offering of savory meat before them, and when I came nigh to them with the meat that they might eat, they all at once stretched forth their hands to eat before the great one had put forth his hand to eat. And the large one saw their works that they did before him, and his anger was violently kindled against them. And he went and took the hatchet that was in the house, and he came to them, and he broke them all. And behold, the hatchet is yet in his hand, as thou seest." So he blames the big idol for destroying all the little idols that had tried to dishonor the big one by eating first, the offering. But Terah then is incredulous. He doesn't believe that any such thing could have happened, and he walks right into Abram's trap. Terah says, "What is this tale thou hast told? Thou speakest lies to me. Is there in these gods spirit, soul, or power to do all that thou hast told me? Are they not wood and stone? Have I not made them myself? And canst thou speak such lies, saying that the large God was with them and that was with them smote them? It is thou that didst place the hatchet in his hand, and then sayest he smote them all. So Terah understands that the big idol didn't actually smash anything. So of course then Abram still is his name, has a ready answer for his father. So it's this anti-idolatry polemic. He says, how canst thou then serve these idols in whom there is no power to do anything? So he checkmates his father, and after having another very long diatribe against idolatry, Abram concludes with relish by taking the hatchet from the last idol's hand and smashing it too before running away. A happy idol smasher. So as strong as this argument against idolatry seems, it's ultimately based on a misunderstanding of the use of statues in worship. So it's either people aren't getting what people who use statues in worship are actually understanding the statues to be, or they're deliberately not getting it in order to make their aniconic case. So adherents do not believe the statue is a god literally, or at least they're not supposed to. Their priests, the people who are their theologians, will tell them the statue is not literally the god, and people, even Terah, would understand the statue is not going to move. While it may be seen as being blessed or sanctified or having some kind of a spark of the god within it, the statue is primarily a way for the worshipers to connect with a divine force that is obviously much greater than the statue's confines. The statue is not the god. The statue points to the god. It's used in worship to connect to the god. So as things developed, for example, as the bulk of Second Temple Judaism evolved into Rabbinic Judaism, the inheritance of Mosaic commandments against depicting God and all of these traditions against idolatry led to Aniconism and Judaism. So not only is God not depicted in synagogues and Jewish worship, but actually even over time, tradition developed, certainly by the time Rabbinic Judaism is evolving, the tradition developed that God's name is actually not to be spoken. And so when you get to the Tetragrammaton, the 4 letters in the Hebrew script that form the name, YHWH in English, instead of saying the name the way I always say, I say Yahweh all the time because I'm not Jewish, you're supposed to say Lord, Adonai, when you get to that. So some Orthodox Jews write even the word God with a dash instead of an O. You've probably seen G-D before. It's done to avoid writing the word God, which is another way of naming God, which we're trying not to do. Similarly, although there have been variations in practice among all of history of Islam and also the many cultures and sects of Islam, if anything, Islam is generally more aniconic than Judaism. And so in addition to strict prohibitions against depicting God, most Muslims also will not depict prophets, including especially Muhammad, although traditionally or historically there are some kind of workarounds that some cultures, so for example, this is a 16th century Persian miniature of Muhammad, but with Muhammad veiled. And so there's a veil, so you're not actually seeing, there are pictures of him with a veil covering his face, so you're not actually seeing a depiction of his face. Another convention would be just that fire that's all around him, just having that fire cover over, so you're not seeing any actual faces. And so for some, that would be a way to not have a depiction. But For other Muslims, just even doing this much is not something that they would do within their own religious paintings and so forth. So as a result of that, because some interpretations in Islam depict actually, certainly people, so people are made in the image of God, and so you might accidentally be depicting God by having that, or indeed some cases any living beings at all, any beings that breathe. That has led to, in Islam, this development of amazing decoration using calligraphic themes. So a lot of this, if you don't know Arabic, but anyway, if you can see the Arabic letters, a lot of these boundaries here are actually script, so it's actually Arabic writing, geometric, abstract, and other abstract, maybe especially abstract floral prints. So all of these kind of patterns and geometric decoration is how art finds a way when you are prohibited, for example, from depicting human forms or indeed any living things, any living themes. So considering those traditions with the other Abrahamic religions, the strong prohibition against depicting God in Judaism and Islam, why is it okay for Christians to depict God? Why is this the odd Abrahamic religion out? So in addition to paintings like the ones I've been showing from the Sistine Chapel, Christians also make statues of God, and the complexity here between Islam and Judaism and Christianity is that Christians also see God as a trinity of persons, and so of course Christians consider Christ to be God, and so of course there are statues of Christ, and the Spirit is God, and so you see pictures and images of a dove. There's a dove here at the little circle at the top of this one. But also the first person of the Trinity, God the Father, is also depicted sometimes even in statues. So for example, this is a kind of a relief statue of God the Father. You can tell he's got the triangular halo, which is one of the symbols for that artistically, as opposed to a guy with a beard that has a round halo with a cross behind it would be God Christ. Wouldn't this kind of depiction, especially a statue of God the Father, wouldn't that violate that commandment that we read from Deuteronomy earlier? You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, and so on, as thus altarpiece. Isn't that breaking the Ten Commandments? And I'm going to suggest, yes, that does violate the Ten Commandments, and that is not a big deal for Christians because some very confused people in Louisiana aside, Christians are not supposed to be adhering to Mosaic law. And according to the New Testament, to the Christian Bible, Christ fulfills the Old Testament covenants, and now we are operating by grace. The Ten Commandments include lots of things that we shouldn't do, like lie and steal and kill, but we're not doing those because they're in a set of commandments. We're not doing those because we're living the higher spiritual law of the new covenant according to the Christian understanding. There are hundreds of commandments in the Old Testament that Christians do not follow. So even though sometimes people want to cherry pick a couple little commandments out of Leviticus and hold those up as if that has anything to do with Christianity, the answer is, but why are you eating pork then? Why are you having shellfish and so forth? Those are all, it's because we're not doing that, and that's not what Christianity is about. And so the fact that people confused Christians want to put up these monuments that are essentially monuments against constitutional freedom of religion around in public buildings is a very big confusion of how Christians understand Mosaic law, or traditionally have understood Mosaic law. So the Apostle Paul, in the letter to the Galatians, declared, If righteousness could be gained through the law, then Christ died for nothing. So we talked about this at length in the Ten Commandments lecture, so I won't go into it any more than that, other than to say, Christians are not supposed to observe the law. We don't, for example, out of the Ten Commandments, keep the Sabbath day holy, since the Sabbath day is the seventh day, Saturday, and instead Christians celebrate on the Lord's Day, mostly. Some Christians have misunderstood this, and they're focused on their seventh-day Sabbatarians as a result of this confusion. All right. So while paintings of God in the Sistine Chapel, and specifically God the Father, are famous today, and they inform the popular image of God. So God will be depicted in everything from movies to The Simpsons using this kind of imagery. Turns out actually this tradition of depicting God the Father like this was relatively recent in Michelangelo's day. And I'll note that despite generally Christians just generally, having illustrations and art and not being aniconic, some Christians at different times have been both aniconic and also iconoclastic. So just to begin to kind of trace this tradition of getting a whole body shot of God the Father, like we have in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. One of the earliest ones of these that can be found is about 1.5 centuries or 2 centuries earlier, frescoes by the painter Giotto, for example, in this chapel in Padua. If we zoom in, you can see here, this is God the Father, and again, he's identified by this 3 triangular hat as opposed to by a cross sign, which would make it Christ God. So way before that, 1,000 years before that, the earlier tradition in Christianity for depicting the Father is not a full body shot in any way. And so in the mosaics here in St. Apollinari's Church in Ravenna, Italy, the earlier tradition of God the Father is reflected. And so if you see at the very top above this cross, there's a little hand. And so a hand reaching down from heaven, that's the way Christians initially just pictured the unseeable God the Father, the unseeable first person of the Trinity. So Christians did inherit that same sense from Second Temple Judaism, that God is cosmic and beyond the human capacity to know or see or sense in any way directly. And indeed, the Christian Gospels, the Gospel of John, asserts no one has ever seen God. And that might seem to contradict the rest of the Bible accounts until, for example, where God speaks to Moses face to face, until you get the Christian asterisk that will explain, except here's what we also mean. So Christian ideas that evolve into the Trinity are built on late Second Temple thought that argued that while this cosmic God, as we're understanding God, is beyond any human sensation, we shouldn't despair that we will have no relationship with God, because aspects of God can be observed. So for example, God's glory can be seen written into all of creation, is the idea. And so thinkers like the Jewish Egyptian philosopher Philo of Alexandria, which he had a whole lecture about, posited that God's logos could be sensed in creation as a hypostasis, a personage in the Greek philosophical sense, something akin to what we had seen in the Jewish wisdom tradition, the book of Proverbs, which sees wisdom, embodied wisdom, as a divine being, the first of God's creation, something present with God at creation. So members of the proto-Christian movement believed that Jesus of Nazareth, their leader, who was executed by the Romans, had risen, and they also began to see him then as the Messiah, the Christ. So in Paul's formula, the Apostle Paul, one of the converts to this new movement, the risen Christ was also Lord. So if you remember when I was talking about, instead of when you're coming to God's name in the Jewish scripture, the Tetragrammaton, and you aren't supposed to say Yahweh anymore, and instead you say Adonai, you say Lord, this is essentially what Paul is meaning. So when we cannot see or say or connect with the unseen, unknowable God, this God that is too remote to picture, we instead can visualize and envision the Messiah, the Christ, who is Lord, that is to say, is God's word and glory made manifest and visible in the world. So that's kind of the Christian add-on that gets us to this complexity of the Trinity. It's having some kind of an idea that we can connect with the cosmic God that is otherwise too remote to have much of a relationship with. So instead of directly envisioning then God the Father, Christians were thus able to picture God's logos, God's word, as Christ, as Lord, a bridge between the human and the divine. So if we go back to that passage in the Gospel of John where I had an asterisk, where it says nobody has ever seen God, let's read it in context and with a little bit of decoding. So it starts, in the beginning was the Word, which is to say the Logos, the Christ, this what we now think of as the second person of the Trinity. And the Word was with God, that is to say, is with the Father, the first person of the Trinity, and the Word was God, which is to say the Logos or Christ, the Word is God, but is not God the Father. So it's with God the Father, and it is God, but it is not God the Father. He, Christ, was with God the Father in the beginning. Through him, Christ, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. And the Word, the Logos Christ, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father full of grace and truth. Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. We're done with the law. It's fulfilled. Now we're following this fulfilled new covenant. No one has ever seen God, that is to say, God the Father, but the one and only Son, who is himself God, but not the Father, and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. So in other words, people have not seen the Father directly, but they are able to have a relationship and to have God made known to them through the Son, the Word, God's glory made manifest, the second person of the Trinity. So thus, Christ is the visible Word of the unseeable Father. So this theological idea that the Father created all things through the Logos, through the Word, that allowed Christian artists traditionally to depict Christ in the place of the Creator. And so before we have those modern developments that, or late medieval and then modern developments that I showed you, Giotto and Michelangelo, where the creation is actually depicting God the Father doing creation, previously Christian paintings and statues that are showing the early Genesis story, the creation, and also God interacting with prophets and so on in the Old Testament, those, instead of depicting God the Father, it would simply depict Christ, like we have here in this very famous picture of Christ creating or God creating the cosmos, you can see with the halo that God has, it's got a cross behind it. It's because this is a picture of Christ, because the Father is unpicturable early on. It would just be a hand reaching down. So, despite this idea about Christ as God's Word made visible, so it is kind of a deliberately being able to picture God in this weird kind of way that Christians have, nevertheless, some Christians in various times have found Aniconism persuasive. So they like these arguments because, again, the Bible says don't make images, and it's against idols. Jews and Muslims say that to Christians a lot, and that's sometimes persuasive. And so, for example, when the armies of Islam burst out of the deserts in the 7th century, Muslims provided a very strong challenge to Christians, especially in the Greek East, both physically in the form of the military offensives, but also theologically, because Muslims were offering a much simpler monotheism. Whenever I start going into this complexity of the Christian theology and even describing and explaining the idea of the Trinity, one God, solely it's just one God, but also three persons, three hypostases of God. Everybody in the comments always writes, I hate the Trinity, I hate this idea. so it is complicated. And so when you get a much simpler and aggressively simple monotheism, there is no God but God, and his name is the God, and his prophet is Muhammad, this becomes it's a much easier argument to make than all of the crazy nuance that I've been giving here. So to Muslims, seeing God in three persons, whether that's clad in arcane Greek philosophical terms like hypostases or not, that was simple polytheism. That's paganism. And so Muslim texts from this time, Muslim historians will sometimes, their apologetic texts or argumentative texts, polemic texts, will call Christians the polytheists, because they're continuing to assert that there are three persons of God. And Muslims would say there are three gods. It's one God as far as the Christians are concerned, but in any event, it's complicated. So they're called polytheists. Likewise, the fact that Muslims could come and see Christian depictions of Jesus and other prophets, especially seeing sculptures. Sculptures especially like idolatry. It seems like you've made idols. So for this, in the face of this, the Muslim argument, like I say, was much simpler to make. It doesn't require any of the nuance necessary to explain why the Christian conception of the divine, and also Christian justification for making use of images and sculptures in worship. So this is set against the backdrop of a very real military threat. Arab armies besieged Constantinople, the great metropolis of Christendom, twice, at the end of the 7th and at the beginning of the 8th century. Both times the walls held, and the Eastern Roman, the Byzantine Empire, survived, although much truncated, having lost the provinces of Syria and Lesser Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and all across North Africa to Islam. So possibly in part, reacting to all of these Muslim critiques of the Christian use of statues and images, icons, in worship, the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, in a series of edicts between 726 and 730, prohibited the use of statues and images, icons, in worship. And this was followed by widespread destruction of religious images in the East, the Iconoclasm, the Byzantine Iconoclasm as it's called. And so there's a miniature here from the 9th century that shows a iconoclast destroying a image or icon of Christ. So the Eastern Empire and the Eastern Orthodox Church struggled with this issue a lot until the middle of the 19th century. There was sort of a round when the iconoclasts were out of power, and then there was a resurgence of it. We don't have all of the great arguments or the arguments of what the iconoclasts were after, but essentially after 843, a compromise was reached at the Council of Constantinople, ecumenical council, or a council of the Eastern Church anyway, in Constantinople, which ended up affirming getting rid of statues and not using statues in worship or in churches, but compromising in that it allowed for the veneration of icons, so you could still have images and paintings, and that then, since that time, has continued to be very central in Eastern Orthodoxy. And so you've probably seen kind of the rich tradition of icon painting, and if you've ever been able to go to Greek Orthodox churches, they'll often be covered in beautiful frescoes of all of these traditional Byzantine-inspired icons that are part of telling the sacred story and are venerated in that tradition. So meanwhile, while that was all happening in the East, this was one of many controversies that people in the West didn't really pay attention to or get. They were not as much. There was still Muslims attacking, but it wasn't the forefront of the caliphate. It's people on the frontiers of Islam that are kind of coming in, and they were not providing anyway as much of a at least theological concern, I guess, for the Westerners, for the Latins. So the popes largely remained iconophiles, iconodules, in other words, supporters of the use of imagery in worship, and the Western Church continued to use images, but also statues. So you see, if you go to all of the historic cathedrals, the relief on the outside of them tells the sacred story in all kinds of sculpture and statues. Nevertheless, over time and into the modern era, some Western Christians became iconoclasts during the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, when churches broke from papal control and began to question, as they started unpacking the inherited tradition of Christianity, how much of this tradition is truly Christian and how much perhaps is derived from the West's pagan inheritance, which is also very, very substantial. And so as a result, Protestants, in many cases, not all Protestants, but lots of them, destroyed all kinds of historic Christian artwork. And this is a picture of Protestants going to all of the statues in their churches and taking down, plastering over the frescoes and taking down the statues and consigning them to the flames to create instead, very austere and less decorated places of worship. So there are examples of that when you go around. Also historic churches in Europe. So, for example, here in the Netherlands is a bunch of statues that have been literally defaced. So all of the faces are gone. Defaced in the 16th century by Calvinists in the Netherlands. And one of the legacies of this is that Protestant chapels tend to be much more simple in their decoration, and they may very consciously have they may have stained glass windows with pictures in them and things like that, but there may be a lot less imagery, a lot less statues. Certainly, it's less common, especially, for example, to have a picture or a statue of Christ dying on the cross. It's much more likely to picture the cross just as a plain two pieces of wood, like we see in this kind of picture. Meanwhile, the counter legacy in the Catholic Counter-Reformation, there's a reaction against all the things the Protestant did, and if anything, then we're going to have more statues. We're going to have more images and make the churches even more garishly decorated and that kind of thing. And so just lots more artwork as a result in in Catholic chapels and places of worship. All right, so to sum up, I think you can probably tell my personal preference is actually iconophile. I have a background as an artist and a designer, and I'm sort of in favor of having more art rather than less art. Nevertheless, I'm also very sympathetic with the argument that is made by aniconic religions that once you start picturing God, you're going to give people a false picture of God. You'll start to think that God is some guy in the clouds with a white beard and so on. And to some extent, Plato, to my thinking, also even has a point about the dangers of reading ancient mythology as literal. So in the same way that he was concerned, reading Homer and Hesiod would lead to bad ideas or ideas that he didn't believe were true about the gods or about the ultimate true divine, because instead it's these petty bickering among very anthropomorphized gods. Similarly, God as depicted in ancient texts like Genesis is not consonant with the theological understanding of God in Christianity. So read literally, it gives people who are heirs of Christianity a very simplistic and problematic vision of God. And so that is my take on art, iconoclasm, and idolatry. All right. Well, I want to thank all of you who have been making contributions for supporting here and also PayPal and elsewhere. So thanks to Kelly Higgins, Jules Luce, Ariel Humberto, Tierra Molina, John Klinker, William Gazzoli, Virginia Ortega, Kendall Morris, Charles Reynolds, Eric Nordquist, Galen DaCosta, Alexander McCaffrey, David Ostafin, Stephen Smolnick, Kerman Wingfield, Regan Harrington, the American Legacy Construction, Jason Bishop, Ryan Morgan, and Ron Wagner. I also want to thank people who've made contributions in the YouTube live chat tonight. So JM, Kevin Thompson, Dartha Rama, Julia, James Sweeney, and Bo the Wolf. Thank you all. That is allowing us to continue to produce these and put a lot of time into studying these and making slides. So your questions. Nathan Gale asks, this question is related to idolatry and the problem of universals lecture that I previously gave. Do you find the mathematical debates between Platonists and formalists a type of iconoclastic debate? It's an interesting idea. I have not thought of that before, Nathan, so let's see. I'm not sure if mathematical debates, so maybe mathematical debates are, in mathematics you can find so much more perfection, and so it is much easier to use kind of mathematics as a lens through which to see, eternal perfection, as opposed to trying then to bring that though to meaning in human life. And so, but I don't know if I don't know if it's as stark a divide as saying, well, no, we cannot, we just do not have this. You can't envision God this way using pictures or icons or statues. But it's an interesting idea. Thank you for referencing that. And I like that is not a very well-watched lecture, but I enjoyed it looking up and doing some research for that problem of universals. Taboo Cat says, is there scholarly consensus that the golden calf story in Exodus is a reaction against the worship of calves as Yahweh in the north? I don't know if this is a scholarly consensus. So calves or little bulls are fertility objects. They're related to strength. They're associated with Baal. So but Baal is also, gets absorbed into Yahweh. And so in the north, having these calves, is pretty clearly, I think, connected to that. But I don't know that we can say that there's a consensus to that. I'd say that multiple scholars that I've read have said this. It's not my idea originally or anything like that. But I don't know if there's a full consensus on it, because it is a kind of a conjecture. So James Sweeney, to what extent were the average early Canaanite Greek pagans familiar with the mythology of Homer or the early Bible? Were they literate enough to read them, or would those stories have not mattered too much in their daily worship? So for Homer, you don't need to be literate, because it was an oral tradition. So it's the bards that are performing this and are saying it out loud. And I guess I would also say that even in non-epic poetry like that, which is performed, even mythology that is written texts would be written to be read aloud. But how much you might be familiar enough with the mythology to have it matter in daily worship. So mythology is not the center of worship in general for paganism. So the actual rituals and what you're doing is the most important thing. From our prism and lens of history, looking at religion through the tradition of Judeo-Christianity and Islam, we tend to think of like the text as being the most important thing and the most important part of the religion, especially because that's been true, especially since the Protestant Reformation, when the Bible was posited by Protestants as the sole source of authority. This wouldn't have been the focus, though. The myths and the sacred story might be familiar with all kinds of different sacred stories and myths, but they wouldn't have been as much the center of the religious practice for pagans, both Canaanites and the Greeks. The Greeks would have more mythology. They're very focused on that, or more focused on that than other ancient people. The Romans had almost none of their own, very little mythology anyway, and they adopted a lot of it from the Greeks. Daryl Scott. Oh, thank you so much for your contribution, Daryl. Dartharama. Dr. Joel Baden from Yale Divinity School says the golden calf, fashioned by Aaron in Moses' absence, was the Hebrews worshiping Yahweh incorrectly and not a different God. How does John feel about that? Yes, I agree with that, because that's essentially what I was saying, that Jeroboam, the king of Israel, the king of the northern kingdom, that the northern kingdom is the group that begins the concentration of Yahweh worship and does so using cult items of calves, which are not idols that represent Yahweh, but are representing essentially the footstools of Yahweh. And so this association in the Bible that is anti-northern, that says, "Here are your gods, O Israel," trying to make them into pagan, is a distortion of the northern kingdom's program, seemingly. And in fact, actually, it should be criticized as the people in Jerusalem don't like this, the northern version of the worship of Yahweh, as opposed to saying it was pagan. Jeremy Brown says, what translation of the Bible is John using that uses Asherah poles and Elion? So we had a whole lecture on Asherah, and so we were saying that a bunch of the places where the Bible, where the Hebrew will tell us that there's an Asherah pole or names of God like Elion, that'll be translated in some translations into English as God Most High, and Asherah poles might just be translated as grove or sacred grove. And so the Asherah poles one, I think I pulled from the New International Version, which I normally am using the New Revised Standard Version Update Edition, but that masks this word Asherah pole, and it's in the NIV, I think. And then Elion, for sure that would be like in the names of God version of the Bible, which I sometimes look to find the hidden, in other words, the underlying Hebrew words that are just translated as Lord or God Most High or in some way into English. Crimson 90, is there any archaeological evidence of the ancient Israelites bouncing back and forth between monolatry and polytheism, or does that seem to be purely literary? I think that, well, the archaeological evidence is hard for that. I think that what happens is there's evidence that it's moving from polytheism to monolatry. So they will destroy there's evidence that high places are destroyed, and so on. There's evidences that earlier shrines that have sacred centers that have multiple altars are eliminated, and the old altar is thrown away and gotten rid of, and it's repurposed in the later form. So I don't think it shows this flip-flopping back and forth, but rather the actual historical tradition, despite the literary pretense in the Bible, is actually from polytheism to monolatry to monotheism. Bo the Wolf says, in the same way that you recommend books, please recommend some examples of religious art that you feel is important enough that the general public might benefit from knowing more about. Well, I'm a medievalist. I love all kinds of medieval illuminations, for example. I love going and exploring all of the old churches and cathedrals in Europe, and a lot of times when you do that, you go to the oldest of the churches, you'll find that they've uncovered really old frescoes that have there. I love looking at all of the relief sculptures and the doors and everywhere else, and the windows that are showing all of these kind of stories. Also the eliminated manuscripts that have survived. So an example of a cool cycle of these that the general public might not be too aware of are all of the medieval Spanish illustrations that illuminate books of the commentary of the Apocalypse by a medieval scholar called Beatus of Liébana. And so the Beatus manuscripts have these incredible illuminations that are illustrating the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. But they are, I think they're clearly also something that influenced Picasso. So you'll see this just really amazing, crazy colorful, but also very interesting and abstract art that exists, and maybe not too many people are aware of the Beatus commentaries. That would be a good one to go look at. Another collection of amazing artwork that people are more familiar with is the insular manuscripts that are from the Irish tradition and the Anglo-Irish or Celto-Irish, Anglo-Irish as the Irish spread monasticism around Britain from Ireland and also to the continent. And so you have things like the Book of Kells, but all of the other incredible illuminations there where there's all the patterns and everything. So those are also really cool. People are probably a lot more familiar with those, but I also really like that. There's plenty more. I think that artwork and all of the artwork, for example, that comes down to us through the West, I think that this is one of the saddest parts of this legacy of allowing religion to get misdefined in modern times and making it almost like letting fundamentalists take over the core bulk of people who are still nominally religious in the West, and then imagining that they have anything, modern fundamentalist reactionaries have anything in common with this entire legacy of thought and art, which frankly, all of us are connected to, but because so many people in the West are secular and had dismiss this modern idea of what religion is, they have cut themselves off from the whole legacy of these churches and religious art, the music, everything else. So that I think is one of the shames of the course that people went on, the kind of strange turn that Western society took it during the Enlightenment. Prashant Sharma says, does some kind of iconoclastic impulse survive in Western modern art, Cubism or abstract expressionism, that rigorously eschews figuration? So maybe, yeah, I don't know. So maybe, yeah, they're trying to, at a certain point, they're trying to get away from, in this case, I think, artistic realism. So there had been this highly stylized way of doing art. When you look at the different kinds of medieval art, it's not photorealistic, but when the Renaissance hits and they recover the ideas of perspective and they start trying to paint in ways that become, let's say, more photorealistic, then that moves into a kind of a pattern until that can't go any further, and then we ultimately have photographs, and you don't need artists to be doing that anymore. And so then there's maybe a reaction against that kind of realism, and so that's maybe, as opposed to iconoclasm, it maybe that is the source of that reaction into abstract expressionism. Ricky Palacio says, doesn't Paul forbid eating meat offered to idols? So Paul has a discussion of this because people are asking about it. So some early Christians, so almost all meat in the Roman Empire, at the time of Paul anyway, will have been sacrificed at a temple. So nowadays, a lot of times people think of sacrifices as being Holocaust sacrifices, that is to say, where you burn up the entire animal. But very few sacrifices were Holocaust sacrifices. Instead, what would happen is that all animals that are killed in ancient times are killed ritually, as part of a ritual, as an offering to the gods. And then little parts of them, some of the fat and some of the offal, that's burned. And the rest of it is just butchered, and then it becomes a feast or meat that is sold. And so the problem for early Christians was, well, they're living in this largely pagan city where all the meat is like that. And if they eat meat that was part of this religious ritual, isn't that saying that they believe those gods are gods? And so isn't that blaspheming against the one God? And so, and yet you won't get to eat any meat at all if you don't, because all the meat has gone through this. And so Paul's answer is actually pretty pragmatic. He says, if there's meat, don't ask where it came from. Don't worry about it. If you go to somebody's house and they offer you meat, eat the meat. Don't worry about it. However, if they're doing that to screw with you, and then they say, hey, you ate pagan meat, you're eating meat, that says you believe in a pagan god because you ate that, then don't eat it, he says. So he's more or less, he gives kind of a pragmatic answer to that. So yeah, he's saying if you eat that meat, technically you would be saying that you believe those gods exist, which we don't, and so therefore we shouldn't do it as a general principle. That said, realistically, don't worry about it if you just don't make a big deal about it, is I think the answer to that. I'm paraphrasing, of course. Miguel Angel, if I'm saying it right, Miguel Angel says, Angel says, how come Christ can be at the same level of the Father if one isn't visible and the other is? Doesn't that make Christ lesser than the Father? Not if we define all three persons as co-equal and co-eternal, then they're all this. Then they're not lesser. They just have different properties, and so the one is unseeable and the other is seeable, but they are co-equal and co-eternal. That would be my answer to that. Ron Wagner, were the prophets and saints a replacement for the gods of Rome and Greece? So in some ways, yes. So the problem. So in adopting Christianity, Greco-Romans were not really making a very big theological change, frankly, from where the pagan philosophers had gotten Romans to. So the theologians, the actual theologians and philosophers, as we kind of were showing even in this lecture, when I'm reading about what the Stoics understand about God, the God universe, the world, soul, and everything that, or the transcendent source of the Neoplatonists. Plotinus, even though he doesn't like Christianity, is has a conception that Augustine is able to draw very freely from. So excuse me. So it's not that different a theology, but when you switch from philosophical paganism to philosophical Christianity, you are technically eliminating all of that pagan mythology, those Greek and Roman myths that Plato was so upset with, and you're replacing that with Judeo-Christian myths. And the problem is that the Judeo-Christian myths just have, just so much less imagery to draw on. And that's, I think, is one of the reasons why throughout history, throughout the Middle Ages and into modern times, the Westerners, Christians, continue to draw on Greek and Roman pagan myths, Greek writ myths, in order to tell stories, because there just isn't enough richness of the mythology. It's all too, let's say, religious people, prophets and saints acting in saintly ways or prophetic ways, So there's only so many kind of more mythic stories like Jonah and the whale or something like that, and there's and so that you need more of those things. To that said, yes, the saints are also saint stories, saint lives, the stories of prophets running around doing things, the stories of apostles running around. Those are taking the place in Christianity of having all of those myths and stories about the gods. Michelangelo says again, would you agree with the idea that Aniconism is born from an educated elite's interest in philosophy, while a people's religion of history is always more of an anthropomorphic religion? I think it's easier for a popular religion to be anthropomorphic, but it's not always that way, because there are very popular, aniconic religions. So it's a popular thing also to go and smash other people's idols, and to say you're not allowed to picture idols. And so that's an easy rule to remember. And so certainly, aniconic religions like Islam have done very, very well, even without picturing gods. All right. That's it. Is there any more questions there?
There's a couple more there. Do you see that after here?
No? Where are you? Oh, here. Sorry. Move down. I see there are more questions. William Gasley says, how did Christianity catch fire? Do you follow Rodney Stark's views in The Rise of Christianity? That is, Christianity was not a movement of the lower classes and the oppressed, but instead was built by the upper and middle classes and Hellenized Jews? Or was it really or essentially due to Constantine, based of Paul's converting of the God-fearers? So yeah, I think that those are all kind of components. So Christianity in its first form is definitely a movement of the lowest classes in Judea and Galilee, but that it quickly, in attracting Paul, who is able to preach to the God-fearers, to preach to an urban, not elite, but urban people that have more property, people who are small craftspeople and so on in cities, that it made that leap to become kind of a minority religion in that kind of cities of the Roman Empire. And then it was not there were points where it did better and worse. One of the things I think that is a little bit of a catching fire moment was Diocletian's decision to get rid of it. So Diocletian in his reforms and wanting to moralize and go back to the traditional religion in having those persecutions, I think that some of the examples like Saint Perpetua, upper class Roman woman getting refusing to recant and instead getting martyred by being thrown to the wild animals. And this is not as widespread as Christians make, that everybody was constantly having this happen. But when it did happen during, for example, the Diocletian's persecutions, I think that impressed a lot of people. And that is that's kind of a tipping point that is happening just a little bit before Constantine's conversion, Constantine's self. And then the real catch fire moment, though, is the conversion of Constantine, the patronage of the imperial government, and that's what really makes it go at the end. Jeremy Brown says, John has always seemed quite fond of the documentary hypothesis. Is he starting to move towards a supplementary or layered understanding of the Torah? I just don't want to. I am still very fond of the documentary hypothesis. I just don't want to. I'm prepared with, for example, the synoptic question to say Q is the majority consensus. In other words, the answer to the synoptic problem is that there was a sayings gospel Q. I don't think that the documentary hypothesis holds that level of consensus. I think that a supplementary hypothesis is also kind of standing now side by side with that. I think that a supplementary hypothesis has, though it is missing out on one of the most interesting things of the documentary hypothesis. So it's saying, well, maybe this was never true in the first place, but the idea that that the name of God in the non-Yahwist portions of the Torah, in the other voices, is not revealed until it's revealed to Moses. So a supplementary hypothesis wipes that out by just imagining that the J and E sources, or saying that the J and E sources are just one set or maybe just a bunch of different layers. And so in other words, that doesn't exist. And I think that's a really interesting idea if it is true. And then I also think that having a voice that is very particularly, let's say, denigrating to Aaron, and so in other words, I see that in the Elohist voice, whether or not everybody agrees that you can actually tease out an Elohist voice. And so my answer to this is that I'm still partial to the documentary hypothesis, and I'm actually going to do another lecture that is talking about the supplementary hypothesis and the documentary hypothesis, so that we can put them both together, because I haven't done them side by side. I've kind of promoted the documentary hypothesis in the past, and I think it's only fair to show why the consensus is broken down. Oh, Kelly Higgins, thank you for your support. Isam Yosha says, do you have an opinion about how incongruent tarot images, archetypal readings, might be for someone who is a monotheistic believer? So I am not I'm not learned enough in tarot, and doing tarot readings, and so I don't. I'm sorry to say, but I'm interested in them. I always think tarot, the cards are very interesting visually, and so I like them for that. Well, that's it. Don't forget to like and share this video, subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for all the support that people have given tonight. If you want to donate, you can also always do that at our website, centerplace.ca. Every bit of support helps us bring more lectures to you. We will not be having a lecture next Tuesday because I have to go to a church camp, or I get to go to a church camp and teach an adult class all Monday through Friday. And so I will be back the week after that, and we will announce what that lecture will be.